Have you ever wondered what happens to the souls of truly evil people when they die? Not the person who tells a white lie or loses their temper, but the real monsters among us, the serial killers, the tyrants, the ones who seem to have no conscience at all. Where do they go when their bodies fail them? Throughout my decades of analytical work, I have encountered the deepest recesses of the human psyche. I have sat with patients whose dreams revealed the most disturbing aspects of human nature. And through my research into the collective unconscious, I have discovered something that challenges everything we think we know about death and judgment. Most religions promise hell, eternal damnation, lakes of fire. But what if I told you that according to my analytical observations and the archetypal patterns I've studied, the reality is far more terrifying than any medieval painting of demons and pitchforks? What if hell isn't a place of punishment at all, but something infinitely worse? My colleague, Dr. Michael Newton, a hypnotherapist who spent decades studying the afterlife through thousands of past life regression sessions, stumbled upon discoveries that aligned remarkably with my own findings about the shadow and the collective unconscious. His work, documented in books like Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, reveals a reality so disturbing that it makes traditional concepts of hell seem merciful by comparison. According to Newton's research, which I find consistent with my understanding of the psyche's structure, when we die, our consciousness doesn't simply vanish or get judged by some cosmic tribunal. Instead, something far more sophisticated happens. The soul undergoes what he calls the life review. But for truly evil souls, those who have never integrated their shadow, this process becomes a nightmare beyond imagination. Picture this. You're standing in a vast space that feels both infinite and claustrophobic. There's no fire, no demons, no physical torture. Instead, you're surrounded by a holographic recreation of your entire life. But here's the twist that makes it worse than any hell you could imagine, and what I recognize as the ultimate confrontation with the shadow self. You don't just watch your life unfold, you experience it from the perspective of every single person you ever hurt. I have seen this process in my analytical work with patients. When someone truly confronts their shadow, the dark, repressed aspects of their personality, they experience a similar revelation. They suddenly understand the pain they have caused others, not intellectually, but emotionally, viscerally. Imagine being a murderer who suddenly feels the terror of his victims in their final moments, not as an observer, but as if you are them. You feel their hearts racing, their desperate hope for rescue, their overwhelming fear. You experience their last thoughts about loved ones they'll never see again. And this isn't just a quick flash of empathy, it's the full, excruciating experience, lasting as long as their suffering lasted. But it gets worse. Newton discovered that evil souls don't just experience their victim's pain once, they relive it over and over again, each time understanding more deeply the magnitude of their actions. It's not punishment in the traditional sense, it's education, the most brutal education imaginable. From my perspective as an analyst, this makes perfect sense. The psyche seeks wholeness, integration. When someone has lived a life completely divorced from their capacity for empathy, completely identified with their shadow, while projecting their potential for good onto others, death forces a confrontation with the totality of their being. And here's where it becomes truly terrifying. Some souls, particularly those who committed the most heinous acts, become trapped in this review process. They cannot move forward, they cannot escape. They exist in a state of constant reliving of their victim's suffering, unable to process the overwhelming guilt and horror of what they've done. Newton called these souls the stuck ones. I would call them souls who have become so identified with their shadow that they cannot achieve the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that allows for the integration of opposites. They're not being punished by some external force, they're punishing themselves, caught in an endless loop of experiencing the pain they caused. In my work with patients, I have observed similar patterns. Individuals who have committed terrible acts often become psychologically stuck, unable to move beyond their trauma and guilt. They repeat the same patterns, the same thoughts, the same behaviors, trapped in what I call a complex, an autonomous psychological structure that takes on a life of its own. But there's something even more disturbing about this state. These stuck souls begin to fragment. Think of consciousness like a perfectly tuned orchestra. Each instrument represents a different aspect of the soul: harmony, compassion, wisdom, love. But when a soul becomes trapped in this endless cycle of experiencing its own evil, the instruments begin to play out of tune. The soul starts to break apart. This fragmentation is something I have studied extensively in my research on dissociation and multiple personality. When the psyche cannot integrate traumatic experiences, it splits into fragments, each carrying a piece of the original whole. But these fragments, disconnected from the integrating function of consciousness, can become autonomous and destructive. Newton documented cases where souls became so damaged by their own actions that they lost coherent identity. They became what he described as shadow souls, fragments of consciousness that retained only the darkest aspects of their former selves. These aren't demons in the traditional sense. They're the shattered remains of what were once complete beings. From my analytical perspective, these shadow souls represent the ultimate triumph of the shadow over the ego. They are pure shadow with no balancing light, no capacity for growth or redemption. They exist as archetypal forces of destruction, drawn to corrupt and destroy the psychological wholeness of others. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. According to Newton's research, these shadow souls sometimes attempt to reincarnate. But because they're incomplete, broken, they can't sustain a full human incarnation. Instead, they attach themselves to living people, particularly those who are vulnerable, emotionally damaged, or spiritually weak. This isn't demonic possession as portrayed in horror movies. It's something more subtle and more terrible. It's what I would call shadow possession, the gradual influence of a fragmented, evil consciousness that slowly corrupts its host. The person doesn't become suddenly violent or obviously possessed. Instead, they gradually lose their capacity for empathy, their moral compass slowly erodes, and they begin to make choices that they never would have made before. In my practice, I have encountered patients who seem to be influenced by what I can only describe as autonomous shadow complexes. These individuals would report feeling compelled to act in ways that were completely contrary to their conscious values. They would experience thoughts and impulses that felt foreign to their normal personality, as if some other consciousness was influencing their behavior. Newton reported cases where individuals undergoing regression therapy discovered that their unexplained violent impulses, their inability to feel remorse, or their compulsive need to hurt others stemmed from the influence of these shadow souls. The truly terrifying part, most people affected by this influence never realize what's happening to them. This aligns with my understanding of how the shadow operates. When we refuse to acknowledge and integrate our own capacity for evil, we become vulnerable to being possessed by it. The shadow that we don't own becomes an autonomous force that can influence our behavior without our conscious awareness. But there's another aspect of this that's even more disturbing. Some of these evil souls don't fragment. Instead, they do something worse. They adapt. They learn to hide their true nature, to manipulate the life review process, to present a false version of themselves to the cosmic forces that govern reincarnation. These are the souls that Newton called the deceivers. I would call them souls who have become so skilled at psychological manipulation that they can even deceive themselves about their true nature. They manage to avoid getting stuck in the review process by essentially lying to themselves and to the universe about their true nature. They convince themselves that their evil actions were justified, that their victims deserved what happened to them, that they were actually the wronged party. In my analytical work, I have encountered individuals with this same capacity for self-deception. They are master manipulators, not just of others, but of their own psychological processes. They can rationalize any behavior, justify any action, and maintain a completely false self-image while engaging in the most destructive behaviors. And then they reincarnate. They come back into new bodies, often seeking out situations where they can continue their patterns of evil. They're drawn to positions of power, to vulnerable victims, to circumstances where they can cause maximum harm while maintaining plausible deniability. The most chilling part of Newton's research suggests that these souls often reincarnate in family groups. They seek out families where they can continue cycles of abuse, where their evil can be passed down through generations like a hereditary disease. Children born into these families don't just inherit genetic predispositions to violence or mental illness. They inherit the spiritual corruption of evil souls who have learned to game the system of death and rebirth. This concept aligns with my understanding of how psychological patterns are transmitted across generations. What we call family complexes are often passed down through families like genetic traits. Children unconsciously absorb the psychological patterns of their parents, including their unintegrated shadow material. Newton documented cases where entire family lines seemed cursed with violence, addiction, and moral bankruptcy. Through regression therapy, he discovered that these weren't just families with bad luck or poor choices. They were families deliberately chosen by evil souls as vehicles for continuing their destructive patterns across multiple lifetimes. But here's what makes this worse than any traditional concept of hell. In hell, at least there's the possibility of redemption, of eventual release through divine mercy. In this system, evil souls create their own prisons, and some of them learn to escape not through redemption, but through deception and manipulation. The truly evil souls, according to Newton's research, don't suffer eternally as punishment for their crimes. They either destroy themselves through endless reliving of their victims' pain, or they learn to avoid consequences entirely by becoming master manipulators of the afterlife system itself, and there's no external force stopping them. No divine judgment, no cosmic justice, no ultimate punishment. The universe, it seems, operates on a system of free will that extends even beyond death. Souls are free to choose their path, even if that path leads to their own destruction or the continued destruction of others. This is consistent with my understanding of psychological development. Growth and integration cannot be forced from the outside. Each individual must choose to confront their shadow, to integrate their opposites, to move toward wholeness. The universe respects this autonomy, even when it leads to destruction. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Newton's findings is what he discovered about recognition. He found that souls often reincarnate in groups, playing different roles in each lifetime. The soul that was a murder victim in one life might be the murderer in the next. The abuser becomes the abused. The tyrant becomes the oppressed. This means that someone you know, someone you trust, someone you love, might be the reincarnation of history's most evil souls. They might have no memory of their past lives, no conscious awareness of their former evil, but the patterns, the capacity for harm, the fundamental corruption of their soul remains. Newton reported cases where gentle, loving individuals discovered through regression therapy that they had been brutal killers in past lives. The shock of this discovery often led to severe psychological trauma as they struggled to reconcile their current loving nature with their past evil actions. But even more disturbing were the cases where individuals discovered that someone close to them, someone they trusted completely, showed signs of being a reincarnated evil soul. The subtle manipulations, the lack of genuine empathy, the ability to cause harm without remorse, all hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. This raises a terrifying question. How do you recognize an evil soul that has learned to hide its true nature? Newton's research suggests that there are signs, subtle indicators that reveal the presence of a corrupted soul. They often display what he called selective empathy. They can be incredibly charming and caring toward people they want to manipulate while showing complete indifference to the suffering of others. From my analytical perspective, these individuals exhibit what I would call persona inflation. They have become so identified with their false social mask that they have lost touch with their authentic self. But underneath the charming persona lies a complete absence of genuine feeling and empathy. They're often drawn to positions where they can exercise power over vulnerable individuals. They might become teachers, counselors, religious leaders, or healthcare workers, not out of a genuine desire to help, but because these positions provide access to potential victims. Most disturbing of all, they often target the most innocent and pure souls for corruption. They seem to derive particular satisfaction from destroying goodness, from turning light into darkness. They're spiritual predators feeding on the destruction of others' moral integrity. Newton's research suggests that these evil souls are not random forces of chaos. They're organized, strategic, and patient. They play long games, sometimes spanning multiple lifetimes, working toward goals that transcend individual incarnations. They seek to tip the balance of the universe toward darkness, one corrupted soul at a time. And here's the final, most terrifying revelation from Newton's work. These evil souls are winning, not through dramatic apocalyptic battles between good and evil, but through slow, patient corruption of the world's moral fabric. They're turning good people evil, one choice at a time, one compromise at a time, one small act of cruelty at a time. The traditional traditional concept of hell, with its promise of eventual justice and punishment for evil, is comforting compared to this reality. At least in hell, evil is contained, punished, kept separate from the good. But in Newton's vision of the afterlife, evil is free to roam, to corrupt, to destroy, limited only by its own ingenuity and the willingness of others to resist. So what does this mean for us? How do we protect ourselves from these evil souls? How do we avoid becoming their victims, or worse, their unwitting accomplices? Newton's research suggests that the key is spiritual strength and moral clarity. Evil souls are drawn to weakness, to confusion, to moral ambiguity. They seek out individuals who are unsure of their values, who are willing to compromise their integrity for personal gain, who are spiritually vulnerable. From my analytical perspective, the strongest defense against evil souls is what I call individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person. This involves confronting and integrating your own shadow, developing a strong sense of your authentic self, and maintaining clear boundaries between yourself and others. The strongest defense against evil souls is to become the kind of person they cannot influence or corrupt, to develop unshakable moral principles, to cultivate genuine empathy and compassion, to strengthen your spiritual connection to the forces of good in the universe. But even this may not be enough, because according to Newton's findings, the battle between good and evil doesn't end with death. It continues across lifetimes, across dimensions, across the very fabric of reality itself. And in this eternal struggle, traditional concepts of justice, punishment, and redemption may be nothing more than comforting illusions. The reality may be far more terrifying than any hell we could imagine. It's a universe where evil souls are free to choose their own fate, where they can escape consequences through deception and manipulation, where they can continue their destructive patterns indefinitely. And the most disturbing part, they're not just choosing their own fate, they're choosing ours as well, one corrupted soul at a time, one destroyed life at a time, one compromised moral choice at a time. This is the reality that Newton's research reveals, and what my own analytical work has shown me in different form. Not hell as punishment, but something infinitely worse. Hell as choice, hell as strategy, hell is an ongoing campaign against the light itself. What do you think? Are you ready to face this reality? Are you prepared to defend yourself against forces of evil that may be far more sophisticated and patient than anything we've imagined? The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, in Newton's vision of the afterlife, even death may not free you from the consequences of that choice.